Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. I'm conscious that I'm in that very special position of standing between its audience and an already quite late lunch, so I shall try to be as concise as possible. I'm going to take the economic crisis head on and talk about probably what's the European Commission's only long-term response to it. We see on the news all the time politicians and commissioners rushing around trying to deal with the immediate situation, but pretty well all of the measures they talk about have a lifetime of 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, maybe at best 2 or 3 years. They don't deal with the long term. My engagement with these issues, when this responds. My engagement with these issues began before what we now would recognize as the crisis years. In late 2005, European leaders met at Hampton Court in England, and at that time their concern was the Lisbon agenda, and I think they were recognizing already that this agenda was not progressing very, very well. To deal with this, they commissioned a small group chaired by the former Prime Minister of Finland, Esko Aho, and 3 others, of which I was one, and said, come back in a month and tell us what we should do. That was one of the most challenging months of my life, I have to say, in work terms. It included Christmas, and it's the first time I had to work right through Christmas Day. But nonetheless, we did get a large response from business and others in telling us that something was wrong in Europe. This is a quote from our report, let me say again, pre-crisis. Europe must break out of structures and expectations established in the post-World War II era, which leave it today living a moderately comfortable life on slowly declining capital. We talked about a society averse to risk, reluctant to change, and struggling against rising competition for the rest of the world. And of course, even talking about Europe being comfortable was only talking about some people in some countries. Why was this the case? Well, even then, there were some bad numbers staring at us. There had been more than a decade of a significant slowdown in productivity growth. This applied across pretty well all countries and all industries. The labour force in Europe was stagnating or even shrinking, particularly in areas of high skills. We've already heard today about our shared dependence on imported natural resources and in particular imported energy, and the cohesion agenda had made very little progress. At that time, GDP per capita varied by a factor of 8 between the richest and poorest member states. I would venture that it's probably widened a little bit since that time. Now, this is not unusual, I should say. In the USA, what they call gross state product, the equivalent of GDP, does equally vary by these large amounts, or perhaps even more. So, against that background, I'm going to ask some questions. You would guess from my title, I'm going to talk about innovation and how to implement an innovation-driven strategy for economic recovery. I'm going to introduce the notion of societal challenges and demand-side policies and ask about what we would need to get an effective research and innovation and industrial ecosystem in Europe. And given that the Commission's main initiatives in this, the EU 2020 initiatives, rest in the Innovation Union and the Horizon 2020, I'm going to ask whether those are sufficient to be the answer. So let's go into the present crisis. Just a quick wind through the history of this with some images from Greece and Ireland, in case you're missing the allusions. We began, of course, with the banks, the bank rescues, the toxic assets, the exotic financial instruments of pumping money into the economy, and a first round of government responses in most countries of trying to stimulate demand through tax cuts and increased public spending. Now, most governments did not truly have the capacity to do this. They substituted public debt for private and created a situation that was unsustainable on top of what were, in many cases, already unsound economies. That's where we are now. I think it's fair to say that most politicians, if you examine their speeches across Europe, do properly recognize that innovation-based growth is the only realistic route to sustainable recovery, but most of them are also very constrained in doing enough to make that happen. We're in a paradox mentioned in earlier presentations that the debt burden is posing a threat to the supply of those resources that could be used to accelerate innovation. Now, not every country is in this dilemma. Just this week, the German government announced an 11% increase in its research and innovation spending, but probably more than half the member states are going in the other direction, or at best are in the situation we are in the UK, with flat spending, with things being cut away at the edges and then being reinserted when politicians have to show that they're doing something about the growth agenda. And we are benefiting from this. In my own university, we're very likely beneficiaries of a £50 million announcement by the Chancellor to invest in graphene, a very remarkable discovery for which my colleagues were awarded the Nobel Prize last year, and which promises to transform both electronics and a whole series of material applications. But what all this is saying, though, is that resources are short. We somehow have to move in this direction. So there is a pressing need for smarter innovation policies and a governance system to support them. The Commission, of course, already had policies in place before all of this started. They had something called the European Research Area, or ERA, as it is commonly known, which is really an effort to wire up and free up the mobility of the European research and innovation system. And I'll come back to that shortly, because they're trying to revamp it at the moment. But it was clear right at the beginning of the crisis that there were things you could use this tool to do. You could try to make the research system itself more productive and therefore give you more for the inputs that were available. You could make it focus more on excellence, make it focus more on priorities, rather than have a program of cutbacks or lack of growth which inflicted general misery. You could share costs between countries, you could share facilities between countries, and you could try to compensate for the fact that not everyone has a full range of resources by allowing them to network more effectively. In extreme circumstances, you could also see European spending as a life support role. Now, I've used the word reverting to life support because it's certainly true that money from the European Commission did act as a life support system for the transition countries in Eastern Europe prior to their accession to the Union. Quite often, institutes were surviving solely on European money. And I think even in Malta, it remains a large proportion of the available research resources for the university and business here. Why would we need to look after the short-term interests of the research system? Why should we privilege this particular group that I happen to belong to? Of course, there are many other people who need support. There are some particular characteristics of research that do need such support.